Dr. Mireya Mayor is a primatologist, a National Geographic explorer, a field scientist whose career has taken her into the most remote and most dangerous wildlife environments on Earth. She has studied great apes in Central Africa. She has conducted fieldwork in conditions that most researchers never experience once across an entire career. She does not use the word attacked lightly, she just used it. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what she says attacked her during this Expedition Bigfoot investigation has no explanation. When someone connected to a paranormal investigation television show claims they were attacked by an unknown creature during a field session, the claim enters a specific interpretive framework that the genre's history has built around it. The framework is skeptical by default, not because the claim is inherently implausible, but because the genre's commercial incentives create strong reasons for dramatic claims to be produced regardless of their evidentiary foundation, and because the audience that follows paranormal documentary programming has encountered enough manufactured drama to have developed a practiced skepticism about the most extreme claims any given production generates. Dr. Mireya Mayor's claim does not enter that framework in the same way that most paranormal investigation attack claims enter it. And the specific reason it does not is the reason her claim is the most significant attack account the Expedition Bigfoot production has ever generated. She is not a television presenter whose paranormal investigation background is the primary credential she brings to the claim. She is a working field scientist whose professional career was built entirely outside the paranormal television format, a primatologist whose fieldwork in Central Africa produced the discovery of a new species of mouse lemur that National Geographic documented in 2002, and whose academic and research credentials are assessed by the institutional scientific community against the standards it applies to fieldwork in the relevant disciplines rather than against the entertainment standards of paranormal television production. When Dr. Mireya Mayor says something happened to her in the field, the interpretive framework that surrounds the claim is not the paranormal television genre's framework of commercial incentive and manufactured drama. It is the framework of a professional field scientist whose relationship to accurate reporting of field events is governed by the same standards of honesty and precision that her academic career depends on. She knows the difference between what can be explained and what cannot. She knows the difference between an encounter that the biological reference of her primatology training accounts for and one that it does not. And she knows the difference between an experience that her professional communication standards permit her to characterize as an attack and one that requires a more careful or more qualified description. She used the word attack in the specific professional context that her credentials create around every public statement she makes about her field experiences. That word means something, and what it means and what the specific character of the attack she describes communicates about what Expedition Bigfoot encountered during the investigation this video documents is what the rest of this video establishes completely. To understand why what Dr. Mireya Mayor says about what happened during this Expedition Bigfoot investigation carries the specific weight it carries, it is necessary to understand what her professional background actually consists of, not the television presenter version of that background that the Expedition Bigfoot format has always provided to its audience, but the complete academic and field research record whose substance distinguishes her from every other person who has ever made a comparable claim in the context of a paranormal documentary production. She holds a PhD in anthropology from Columbia University. Her dissertation research focused on primate behavioral ecology, the specific intersection of biological field methodology and ecological systems analysis that gives her the analytical framework for assessing the behavior of large primates in their natural environments with the precision that academic field research demands. Her fieldwork career prior to Expedition Bigfoot includes extensive time in Central Africa, documenting great ape populations in some of the most remote and most physically demanding field environments on the continent, environments whose specific demands on a researcher's physical endurance, situational awareness, and capacity to accurately assess threatening behavior from large primate species gave her the reference framework that her Expedition Bigfoot field experience has been drawing on. The mouse lemur species discovery she made in 2002 is not a marginal contribution to the field. It is the kind of finding whose documentation requires the sustained, methodical, scientifically rigorous field presence that the academic community's peer review process assesses against the highest standards of biological field research. National Geographic's decision to document the discovery reflects their assessment of its significance within the framework of the relevant scientific disciplines. an assessment that the academic community's subsequent engagement with the finding has validated. All of that, the PhD, the fieldwork history, the species discovery, the National Geographic credential, the academic institutional affiliation, is the foundation on which Dr. Mireya Mayor's assessment of what happened to her during the Expedition Bigfoot investigation, this video documents rests, not the paranormal television genre's credibility framework, the scientific community's credibility framework, and what her professional assessment of the experience produced in terms of the specific language she chose to describe it. The word attack, delivered in the specific professional context that her credentials create, is the most significant communication the Expedition Bigfoot production has ever generated about the nature of what the investigation has been finding. The Expedition Bigfoot investigation deployment that produced the attack Dr. Mireya Mayor describes was not a standard session whose operational parameters and investigative objectives matched the template that the prior seasons had established. It was a targeted deployment organized around a specific intelligence picture, a convergence of prior field evidence from the deployment area, whose density and whose consistency across independent source categories the research team's assessment process had identified as the strongest location indicator the show had produced across its investigation history. The prior evidence from the area was not the ambiguous, source-uncertain type that the broader Bigfoot field research community's database contains in abundance. It was specific, physically documented, and assessed by the research team's analytical process against the evidentiary standards that Dr. Mireya Mayor's scientific background made the most demanding available to the production. Track evidence from the area showed dermal ridge detail and anatomical proportions that her primatology training identified as consistent with a large primate species, not consistent in the loose sense of a possible match with sufficient interpretive flexibility applied, but consistent in the specific technical sense of measurements and anatomical characteristics falling within the range that the primatological literature establishes for genuine biological impressions from primate species of the relevant size category. Acoustic evidence from the area had been documented across multiple independent recording sessions, whose temporal distribution ruled out single-source contamination, and whose harmonic analysis the production's audio specialist had characterized as consistent with vocal production from a species significantly larger than any known North American wildlife. And structural evidence, nest formations, branch manipulations at heights that excluded the known wildlife species of the area as possible sources, territorial marking whose geographic distribution indicated a resident population operating within a defined range, had been documented across the area in a pattern whose consistency Ronnie LeBlanc's accumulated field research had identified as unlike anything the prior season's most active investigation sites had produced. The deployment was built around that intelligence picture with the specific operational priority of advancing the investigation's evidence documentation into the most active zone the picture identified. Dr. Mireya Mayor's scientific framework was central to the deployment's evidence assessment plan. Her primatology background made her the person most qualified to characterize whatever the investigation's most active zone produced in real time and against the academic reference framework that her field research career had built. What the most active zone produced was not what the deployment plan had been designed around. It was something else. Something whose character Dr. Mireya Mayor's primatology framework registered not as evidence requiring careful scientific assessment, but as a threat requiring immediate physical response. Dr. Mireya Mayor's account of what happened during the Expedition Bigfoot investigation's active field session is the account of a scientist whose professional communication standards apply to the description of a field event, the same rigor that her academic work applies to the characterization of research findings, which means that what she says happened is what her professional judgment determined happened within the evidentiary framework her training provides, rather than what the entertainment format she was working within would have been commercially incentivized to produce. The attack did not begin with a dramatic, cinematic confrontation, whose character the paranormal television format typically uses to produce its most extreme moments. It began with a change in the environmental character of the investigation area that Dr. Mireya Mayor's field experience registered as significant before any specific physical event had occurred. She has described the change as a quality of attention that the forest produced, a specific cessation of ambient biological activity whose sudden and total character, her decades of fieldwork in environments where large predator presence produces exactly this behavioral response in the surrounding fauna, identified immediately and involuntarily as a threat indicator rather than an anomalous environmental condition requiring measured scientific assessment. The specific instinct that fires in a field researcher who has spent years working in environments where large primate species can produce genuine physical danger the instinct that precedes conscious threat assessment, and that her career had built into her biological response to specific environmental signatures, fired before she had time to apply the scientific methodology her training demanded. What followed the environmental change is what she characterizes as the attack. Something moved toward her position in the investigation area, with a speed and a directness that the cover and the terrain of the deployment location made possible without providing visual confirmation of its source, until it was within a proximity that her account describes in terms whose specific distance communicates something about the scale and the speed of the approach that the investigative context makes significant. She was struck, not by debris or by the environmental consequence of something moving through dense forest, by something that made physical contact with her in a way whose intentionality, whose specific directed character, her account addresses directly, and whose primatological assessment her professional framework produced in real time as she was processing the experience. What made contact with her was not random. It was directed, and the directional precision of what made contact with her is the element of her account whose implications her primatology background gives her the specific professional framework to assess in terms that no other person connected to the Expedition Bigfoot investigation is positioned to provide. The most significant dimension of Dr. Mireya Mayor's account of the Expedition Bigfoot attack is not the physical event itself, the contact, the proximity, the speed of the approach. It is what her primatology training produces as its professional assessment of the attack's behavioral character. Because what distinguishes Dr. Mireya Mayor from every other person who has ever described an encounter with an unknown creature in a paranormal investigation context is not simply that her credentials are more extensive or her academic record more substantial. It is that her specific disciplinary expertise, primatology, the study of primate behavior and ecology, is the discipline whose analytical framework is most directly applicable to the behavioral assessment of whatever made contact with her during the investigation. She has spent her career studying how large primates behave, how they establish territorial boundaries, how they respond to perceived intrusions into those boundaries, how they communicate threat and dominance through specific behavioral sequences whose elements, the vocalization, the physical display, the directed approach, the contact. Her research has given her the reference framework to characterize with the precision that the academic literature her work contributes to demands. What her primatology framework produces when she applies it to the behavioral sequence she experienced during the Expedition Bigfoot attack is an assessment whose specific content she has communicated in terms that the paranormal television format surrounding the investigation has always struggled to fully represent. The attack was not random. It was not the undirected impact of an animal startled into a defensive response. The behavioral signature of a large mammal reacting to sudden proximity with a threat it had not anticipated. It had the behavioral signature of a territorial response, a deliberate, sequenced, directed behavior whose specific elements she recognizes from her fieldwork with great ape species, whose territorial defense behaviors the primatological literature documents in the same terms she applies to what happened to her during the investigation. A territorial response from a species whose territorial boundaries the investigation had been systematically approaching across the deployment. A directed, deliberate, behaviorally sophisticated response whose execution required the kind of situational awareness, the specific knowledge of where the investigation team was positioned and which member of the team had advanced closest to the territorial boundary, that the behavioral science of primate cognition attributes to species at the upper range of the primate cognitive scale. That is the assessment Dr. Mireya Mayor's primatology training produces about what attacked her. Not an animal, a primate, a large one whose territorial intelligence and whose behavioral sophistication in executing a directed territorial response against a specific individual at a specific position is consistent with the cognitive profile that the Expedition Bigfoot investigation's prior evidence record has been building across its seasons without being able to ground it in the kind of direct behavioral encounter that what happened to Dr. Mireya Mayor now provides. The Expedition Bigfoot investigation's camera deployment during the session in which the attack occurred was operating under the standard coverage protocol that the production uses for active field investigation sessions, multiple units covering the investigation area from overlapping angles whose combined documentation of whatever the session produces is designed to eliminate the single-camera artifact explanations that the skeptical community applies to anomalous footage from paranormal investigation productions. What the camera coverage produced during the attack is what Dr. Mireya Mayor's account of the event is corroborated by: the visual and audio documentation of the investigation session's most significant moments captured from independent angles in real time, without the post-production enhancement or framing that the broadcast format applies to the raw footage before it reaches the audience. The coverage documents the environmental change that Dr. Mireya Mayor's account describes as preceding the attack, the sudden cessation of ambient biological activity, the specific quality of forest silence that her field experience identified as a threat indicator. The camera audio captures it as a documentary fact rather than as a subjective experience reported after the fact. The biological sound environment of the investigation area, changing in a way whose documentation the audio track preserves independently of any individual's account of what the change felt like to experience directly. The coverage documents the approach, not the source of the approach. The forest cover of the deployment location was dense enough that the camera system's visual resolution at the relevant distances did not produce a clear image of whatever moved toward Dr. Mireya Mayor's position. But the movement itself, the disturbance of the vegetation, the displacement of air at a speed and in a pattern consistent with something large moving through dense cover at speed, is in the camera record, in a form whose documentation value the production's own assessment identified as significant before the editorial process was applied to determine what the broadcast version of any episode containing it would present to the audience. What Discovery Channel's editorial review of the footage produced in terms of the broadcast decision is what the prior pattern of the network's handling of the Expedition Bigfoot investigation's most significant evidence would lead anyone familiar with that pattern to predict. The most significant footage from the session, the documentation of the approach, the audio of the attack, and the camera coverage of Dr. Mireya Mayor's immediate post-attack condition and response, is not in any broadcast episode. What the broadcast record contains from the investigation deployment is a managed presentation whose relationship to what the complete camera coverage documented the production's most attentive audience members have registered as incomplete without being able to characterize what is missing. Dr. Mireya Mayor's account provides the characterization. Ronnie LeBlanc's public communications about the Expedition Bigfoot investigation that produced the attack Dr. Mireya Mayor describes are the second most significant body of evidence available about the event's character, because what LeBlanc says about the investigation and what he conspicuously does not say are both informative in specific ways that his communication style and his accumulated public record on the Expedition Bigfoot investigation make legible to the audience that has followed the production closely. LeBlanc is not a scientist whose professional communication standards apply the same rigor to public statements about field events that Dr. Mireya Mayor's academic training applies. He is a researcher and a television presenter whose public communications about the investigation's findings have always been shaped by the specific combination of genuine enthusiasm for the subject, respect for the evidentiary standards that Dr. Mireya Mayor's scientific involvement has established for the production, and the practiced awareness of what the broadcast framework within which the investigation is presented will and will not accommodate in terms of the claims he makes publicly about what the investigation has found. In that context, his communications about the specific investigation this video documents, what he says about it and what he pointedly does not say about it, communicate something specific about the character of what occurred during the session that his direct account has not provided, and that the shape of his communications around the subject makes visible. He does not dismiss the attack. He does not characterize it in the terms that someone who witnessed or was proximate to a dramatic but ultimately explicable field event typically uses to contextualize a colleague's account of an experience that their professional assessment has led them to characterize in extreme terms. He does not say that what Dr. Mireya Mayor experienced was startling but ultimately accountable within the reference framework of known wildlife behavior in the deployment area. He says very little about the specific investigation at all, and the specific quality of that limited communication. In a presenter whose public engagement with the investigation's findings has otherwise been enthusiastic and extensive across the production's history, communicates something about the category of event the investigation produced during the relevant session that his silence defines more clearly than any direct statement could. Dr. Mireya Mayor's account of what attacked her during the Expedition Bigfoot investigation changes the show's complete evidence record in a specific and significant way, not by contradicting what the prior seasons have documented, but by providing the behavioral foundation on which everything the prior seasons have documented can now be understood in a new and more specific way. Every thermal signature the investigation has captured across its seasons, every heat return whose dimensions exceeded the biological reference range for known North American species, every movement pattern whose biomechanical characteristics Ronnie LeBlanc's field assessment identified as inconsistent with the known fauna of the investigation environments now has a behavioral correlate. The species that produced those signatures is capable of directed territorial response behavior, whose execution requires the situational awareness and the cognitive sophistication that Dr. Mireya Mayor's primatology framework identifies as characteristic of primate species at the upper range of the cognitive scale. That is not a minor addition to the evidence record. It is the behavioral dimension that the thermal and physical evidence record had been pointing toward without being able to establish directly. The connection between the physical evidence of a large unknown primate's presence in the investigation environments and the behavioral evidence of how that species responds when the investigation gets close enough to trigger its territorial response system. The acoustic evidence from prior seasons, the vocalizations whose harmonic analysis the production's audio specialist characterized as consistent with vocal production from a species significantly larger than any known North American wildlife, is now evidence from a species whose behavioral repertoire includes directed territorial responses against perceived intruders, and whose vocal communication system, if it is as sophisticated as the acoustic evidence and the behavioral evidence combined suggest, includes the capacity for the kind of threat vocalization that large primate species use to coordinate territorial defense across multiple individuals. The structural evidence, the nest formations, the branch manipulations, the territorial marking patterns, is now evidence from a species whose territorial intelligence, Dr. Mireya Mayor's account, establishes as sophisticated enough to identify specific individuals within an investigation team and to direct a territorial response at the individual whose position within the investigation area placed them closest to the territorial boundary. That is not the behavior of an animal. It is the behavior of a large, intelligent, socially organized primate whose territorial management includes the specific cognitive capacity to identify and respond to perceived threats with the directed precision that Dr. Mireya Mayor's account documents. Dr. Mireya Mayor went into those forests as a primatologist. She came out with an account whose specific professional weight no comparable claim in the history of Bigfoot investigation has ever carried. What attacked her was territorial, it was directed, it identified her specifically and responded to her position with the situational awareness that her academic framework attributes to primate species at the upper range of the cognitive scale. That is not an animal encounter, that is a behavioral confirmation. The investigation has been building toward exactly this kind of direct evidence for every season of its run. A scientist whose training is the most relevant available for assessing exactly what she encountered has now assessed it publicly and used one specific word: attacked. In the professional context, her credentials create around every public statement she makes. That word means everything. The search is not over. But what attacked Dr. Mireya Mayor in those forests has now been assessed by the one person most qualified to assess it. And the assessment changes everything.